A few years ago, we used to think about tech in general, but AI in particular, as like the cutting edge and luxury products. And more, no, the luxury products is whatever is made for and by human beings. I'm Carissa Véliz. I'm an associate professor at the Institute for Ethics in AI at the University of Oxford. I am the author of Privacy is Power, and I specialize on privacy and AI ethics.
I'm Dr. Alex Connock. I'm a senior fellow at the Saïd Business School, University of Oxford, and my specialism is AI and media, and I wrote a book called The Media Business and Artificial Intelligence. And so I'm going to kick off, Carissa, with the idea that AI is going to allow people to create video content of unimaginable complexity that defies the laws of physics, and is going to democratically empower the average citizen to be able to make Star Wars or 2001: A Space Odyssey in a way that was never possible before, when the media was controlled by an oligarchical elite.
I think that is the optimistic view, but of course there are so many concerns that underlie that. And one concern is that these systems have been trained on a lot of data on the internet, a lot of YouTube videos and a lot of content by artists. And these artists haven't been paid, haven't been compensated in any way. And it seems like these systems are mimicking their work. And so one question is, okay, yeah, we might be able to make these kind of really fun videos, but we're not paying for the labor of the people who enabled it. And also, what happens to all those jobs? The film industry, of course, employs hundreds of thousands of people. And what happens to all those people who used to create these amazing images before we could do it with AI?
Yeah, well, let's take this one by one. So first of all, on the issue of ownership, there are some who say this might be the use of blockchain that we've been looking for. And that, we've been scrambling around for half a decade trying to find something useful to do with blockchain. And actually pinning each piece of content to some kind of blockchain identity might allow the training data sets to be, in inverted commas, owned by the individual creators, and then outputs of those training data sets to be monetized by the creators in infinitesimally small amounts in a kind of digital rights management way, in the way that a piece of music can be claimed on YouTube now. So we could again end up with a more democratic form of content ownership, where someone strumming their guitar in Seville in Spain, who gets sampled in a Jay-Z track in New York, gets 0.2 of a cent every time that's done. How do you feel about that?
I think it's an open question whether that's empirically feasible. So some people think that because these systems mix so many things together, it would be impossible to be fair in that allocation of resources. And a second worry is that even if we manage to exactly track what is being kind of copied or used, it might be the case that you would get a few cents for your work. So we get that in personal data, which is something I write about in Privacy is Power. And some people think that it might be a good idea if people could sell their data directly. But actually, this data is only very valuable to people, to companies who can have billions and billions of data points. And to the individual, it's not very valuable because you can't do much with it. And even if you sold it, you would get very little money. So whereas an artist could make a living before AI, it might be that after AI, they get a few cents or a few dollars. And that doesn't really add up.
Yeah, no, I take the point. I thought it was fascinating that when Meta were apparently considering buying Simon & Schuster, the publisher in America, they were thinking about the value of a book for training data purposes of about $10. In fact, not even $10. And that's quite galling for people who write books all day in a university like Oxford, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. If you want to make a living as an author, that business model doesn't seem very attractive.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the other point you made at the opening was about jobs. And you said that it might be that entertainment industry jobs will put in peril. What about the alternative argument that the ability of AI to simultaneously translate at scale, so it could be managing content in Squid Game, for the sake of argument, in 150 languages, in eponymous speech, such that the original voice was synthesized into different languages and the lips moved in sync and so forth? What about the idea that that might actually create a new vernacular, a new global understanding, and that if we're able to see kind of native culture from each country around the world, as if it were our own language, that would at some level make human understanding amplified? And is that at all reasonable, do you think?
I think it's interesting, and we've already seen it a bit. I mean, I remember traveling before, AI translation was available, and it was a lot harder. Now you can find yourself in a very remote place and communicate the most basic things, like, where is food? And of course, this is kind of an escalation of that, and it does have attractive features. But there are a few concerns. So one concern is the dominance of English. So it's not exactly that, we are going to be able to access all these languages. It's more like these languages get translated into English. And in that translation, there is a loss. There are words that you cannot translate. And of course, these systems have been mostly trained in English. And so they're much less accurate in other languages. So there's that concern. And then there's also the concern of, even if it's true that we have all these good things, what's the price to pay? How dangerous are they? So one of the things that I'm becoming increasingly concerned about is how much it invites for scams of all kinds, from using AI in ways that make elections worse and that kind of put into question the integrity of elections. And we've already seen this in some countries, so it's not even theoretical. To just everyday citizens being much more exposed to not only fake news, but also scammers of all types. So people using AI to try to break into bank accounts. And so is the good more than the bad?
Yeah, but I suppose one could say we're in a kind of short-term period where deepfake technology is better than the kind of cops. Kind of the robbers are outrunning the cops at the moment. But ultimately, AI itself could be used to spot deepfakes or the outputs of deep learning that are fake, whether that's voice or video or text. And that therefore, over time, we might be able to mitigate that risk. Do you think that's likely? Or do you think that the kind of bad actors will always outrun our ability to track them and recognize them?
I'm not very optimistic in this regard for a few reasons. One is that you have to have in place really good laws, and you might have countries that don't have an interest in respecting those laws. So, kind of troll farms in Russia might not have an interest in respecting the watermarking techniques of AI. And then another reason is that it seems like up until now, we haven't figured out how to do that well enough. So there have been some tests of watermarking AI, and it turns out that it's quite easy to get rid of that watermark. So if you're an ordinary citizen, you might not know exactly how to do it, but if you're tech savvy, you will be able to do it. And then there's a concern about whether it would have to be regulated very well, and we haven't done that yet. I think we will do it and we will get better at it, because it might not be in the interest of companies to have these watermarks. They have an interest for these systems to be used as much as possible, among other reasons, because that's the way they get more and more data.
Yeah, and certainly if you talk to people in the kind of security field, they will tell you that they're not worried about the large language models they know about that might be capable of being watermarked. They're worried that other large language models might be around, especially now that they've been downloaded onto laptops, that are not recognized and not capable of being recognized. Okay, second big question. I was listening to an interview with Ilya Sutskever today, who, as you probably know, is the sort of tech genius behind OpenAI and one of the guys who created the large language model known as GPT-4, which lay behind ChatGPT. And he was asked, do you envision a future where we're all kind of lazily sitting around in a kind of Wall-E way because AI is doing all the jobs and AGI, artificial general intelligence, has been discovered? And he said, well, yes, but actually I envisage that as a future where AI could assist us in making the really big philosophical decisions about our lives and having a better world model that we're capable of better understanding the true human condition. And he was then asked, well, would you even incorporate some AI into your own brain? And he said, yes, I might consider doing that. How do you feel about this idea of a future where we have an AI-enhanced kind of enlightenment, like a kind of 18th century moment of new understanding? How do you feel about that?
So I think that is a very typical answer from an engineer. So I teach many different kinds of students. And if I were to get that from a student, it would be from an engineer. So I think part of what it means to be human and part of what it was for the Enlightenment to be the Enlightenment is kind of an understanding of the human experience, which I think is fundamentally inaccessible to AI. So when a large language model says that apples are very sweet, it's not that it understands what it means for something to be sweet, or it doesn't have a sense of the texture of an apple. It's just ingested thousands and thousands of accounts in which human beings report that apples are sweet. So in the same way, You might get AI to say things that are quite poetic and that might kind of make sense, but it doesn't really reflect experience behind it. There's nothing it's like to be an AI up until now. And I think with that piece of the puzzle missing, you cannot have an AI that is a moral agent, and therefore we shouldn't allow it to make important decisions, and definitely not decisions about like what it is to have a good life and how do we structure society to get there.
I think that's a really interesting point. So do you think if I were to, Oxford is the kind of one of the spiritual homes of libraries. If I was to walk into the Bodleian Library, I would be walking into kind of 700 years worth of kind of Western society summed up in the kind of endless bookshelves of the Bodleian Library. If you had a machine on your laptop that had the summation of that knowledge and had it all vectorized and capable of being re-outputted in answer to any question, do you not feel that might at some level represent some kind of enlightenment or some kind of new facility?
New facility, yes. Enlightenment, I think, is a stretch. It might be like a good map to find things that otherwise would be very hard to find. But already we're seeing evidence of how, AI is creating more and more content, and in turn, it's ingesting that content as part of its new training. And as it does that, it deteriorates and deteriorates in quality. And I think it's because it just kind of every time it trains on data that is not created by human beings, it's just one step further removed from the world of things and from experience. So one analogy that Ted Chiang used is the idea of photocopying. So AI is kind of photocopying our reports of the world, but every time it photocopies it again, the quality is deteriorated until you get a very blurry image.
That's known as dog fooding, isn't it? And it's a really persuasive idea, I have to say. Okay, let's bring it back to the mundane. Let's think about the kind of corporate life. So how do we think AI is going to improve the corporate life? Do you think there are ways in which the kind of mundane nature of office life, or most jobs that people do, or most rote things that companies have to do, or chat, customer response, or what have you, do you think any of that is actually going to represent a positive development for humanity, and that perhaps jobs that haven't been that fulfilling in the past, whether in the media or in fact any walk of corporate life, are actually going to become more kind of sentient in a way, because the AI will be taking over all the mechanistic roles?
I think that's possible, and we should strive to do that, but let's not take it for granted that it's going to happen, because it depends on us. And as long as companies have profit as their main motive and only motive, it's not going to happen automatically. We need to have like a richer sense of what it is to have a good life and how work interacts with that. And so I'll give you some examples. But so if AI could take care of my email and marketing, that would make my life much better. But in fact, what I've seen with automation is that it's not a blanket thing, right? So for instance, every time I use my washing machine, it saves me 2 hours of manually washing my clothes, and that's a fantastic thing. And my grandmother would have been amazed to have that, or like, my great-grandmother. However, I spend 3 hours a day doing email that my great-grandmother didn't have to do.
Yeah.
And so sometimes some automation in some areas creates other tasks that are menial in other areas. And up until now, we have seen a trend of automation creating jobs that are harder for human beings, because the job is adapted for the machine and not for the human being. And so we have to be very mindful of that.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Okay, final question, I think. Do you, thinking about the kind of structure of the way the new media landscape is going to be organized, do you think that this is an opportunity for a new generation of kind of democratic empowerment to come through? And 100 startups will bloom, and we will end up with a much more competitive landscape that frees us from the oligopoly that essentially has owned the internet for the last 20 years? Or do you, on the other hand, I think I know the answer, but do you, on the other hand, feel that perhaps a kind of a perpetuation of that oligopoly is happening because of the sheer expense required to build these large language models, and that we might end up with a world where there are just a few God models, in quotes, which are then powering the rest of society, and actually power will then be held in even fewer hands than it has been thus far?
I worry about the latter. So in keeping with our routine of good cop and bad cop. And, how many large language models can you name? Just a few, just a handful. And probably a couple of those are more dominant. And part of it has to do with the sheer amount of data that these companies have, but also the amount of wealth. It's very expensive to run these systems. So one estimate is that A query for ChatGPT is about 1,000 times more expensive than a search engine. And so there are also questions about the ecology of it. Is it worth it? So obviously the internet and these systems run on natural minerals and energy and this, real stuff. The cloud is not a cloud.
Yeah.
And so there are also concerns about that. So yeah, I think we have to strengthen our democracies and also our business ethics to make sure that AI can be positive in the long run.
Yeah, I saw an interview the other day with Mark Zuckerberg from Meta saying that he estimated they would spend $100 billion on vectorizing their content, on mapping the statistical relationships between words across a vast scale of humanity, which is an extraordinary amount of money. That's double the UK's defense budget, for example. And I think that's probably the world we're heading towards, and I think it probably does, unfortunately, tend towards ownership in the hands of very few. There are probably maybe 10 large language models in the West at the moment, and most other products are derived in some way from them. And most of them, in fact, almost all of them, are owned in some way by the previous generation of media companies. Look, it's been really fascinating discussing these kind of meta issues, and we could probably carry on all day with that. And I personally love discussing, the way sound or music or film or TV are going to change. But perhaps what we should do is look at some questions that have been sent in to us by people who are interested in this conversation. Should we each pick up a card and then pose the question to the other?
Yes, let's do that. Okay, let me start. Are there going to be increasingly low levels of trust in news factual content due to fabricated news AI inception? What measures will be put in place to ensure news is relevant and real?
It's such a good question and such a big question. So I think we've already touched on deepfakes. And of course, the magic of a deepfake is that a deepfake doesn't necessarily have to be believed by everybody in order to be efficient. And in fact, all the deepfake has to do is introduce enough doubt into society about the veracity of news at large for people not to believe the true news, and therefore the whole idea of news to become undervalued. I think we see that. Now, of course, there have been some very useful deepfakes. For example, Khan in Pakistan sending out synthetic versions of his voice when he was in jail, one could argue was a democratic plus. But then there have been many, many negative examples of deepfakes. There's interesting dimensions to it, though. So, for example, there was a study by the Reuters Institute in Oxford of companies that had disallowed themselves from being trained upon as training data. And that this was kind of celebrated as a victory for real news because real news was not going to get ingested into the systems. But the problem was the right-wing news sources are not disallowing themselves from being trained upon, which means that the large language models over time may tend to go right-wing because they're going to be fed right-wing content but not middle-of-the-road content. And so all the mitigations that you can think about putting in place against deepfakes have quite subtle and quite serious problems down the line. And this is the world we're in now.
Interesting world.
Yeah, let me try one for you. Is it ethical for brands to use AI for media creation rather than humans? Good question.
It's a very good question. And it depends. It depends partly if there are people losing jobs, if the content that is being created through having been trained in content that was copyrighted or licensed in some ways, and those artists haven't been compensated. But if the answer is yes, then I think it's arguably yes. It might be unethical, and there might be ways to mitigate that. Of course, there are some models that are compensating people. There are some models that are trained in data that hasn't been copyrighted, and of course there are ways to keep the people, your creators, and use AI to make their jobs easier. And that's the most ethical way a company can use AI. Not to get rid of the people, but to actually enhance their capacities with kind of the same resources they had, pretty much.
There is an interesting situation now in particularly programmatic advertising, which is the kind of digital advertising that's sent at scale around the internet, through dynamic content optimization being personalized to the individual user. And one of the parameters in which they're personalizing is ethnicity. But brands are not necessarily going out and hiring 200 different ethnicities to make a commercial. They're using synthetic humans to do that. And so they actually end up with a kind of faux ethnicity, which may be, in fact, doing actors, real actors, out of jobs. There's another issue there as well, which is, do we necessarily want people to be capitalizing on the homophily effect, where people were more likely to respond positively to likenesses of themselves? And is that manipulative? If someone's creating a synthetic version of you in order to market to you. So there's so many issues there.
Yeah, especially with personalized ads.
Yeah.
So one of the things I think we should change is go back to ads that were more wholesome, in the sense that they gave out information instead of taking it away.
Yeah.
And they were less targeted and more open to kind of public scrutiny.
Absolutely.
Let's go on.
We could do a whole tea talk on digital advertising.
We could. Is there going to be a point where AI is used so much nothing will feel authentic?
I think you've already alluded to this. I think there are people who suggest that, even within 5 years, 90% of the content on the internet could be synthetic. And that will lead to the potential degradation of content. And in fact, the large language models are already running out of training data, particularly words as opposed to videos, and starting to use synthetic content to train upon. The outputs of those large language models are already synthetic, but the kind of exponential effect of sequential generations of synthetic could cause real problems. So yes, I think we are going to reach that point. And arguably, we've already reached it. If you look at TikTok or Instagram, many of the images on there are already synthetic. So yes, very significant likelihood that that's going to happen.
Yeah, it's already affecting experience. Every time you see something online, there's a question in your mind, what am I watching?
Yeah.
10 years ago, you wouldn't even kind of...
Yeah, I do think, however, there's a kind of Newtonian reaction to that. So just as there's a move towards the synthetic content, it's sort of Newton's second law, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. There's also a move towards live. And actually, if you look at the post-pandemic period, there's been a tremendous growth in live entertainment. The Taylor Swift tour, $4 billion, the booming Live Nation venues, the booming sports and so forth. And Glastonbury sold out within minutes and so forth. And I think that's because people don't just want a synthetic world. They don't just want a metaverse. They also want the kind of muddy fields of Glastonbury and the burning heat of Burning Man and what have you. And I think that people actually are quite ready to kind of coexist both in a real universe and in a synthetic universe. And that in a sort of utopian sense could create quite an interesting future.
It's interesting how a few years ago we used to think about tech in general, but AI in particular, as like the cutting edge and luxury products. And more, no, the luxury products is whatever is made for and by human beings. Yeah. And the AI is like the second best thing that is cheap and that we use when we don't have access to that kind of...
That's a great point. Well, thanks, Carissa. Look, it's been really fascinating talking to Carissa today with our kind of good cop, bad cop routine. And what's interesting about AI is that within almost any category of it, there are these really interesting ethical and philosophical conundrums that quite thoughtful people around the world are looking at. Even within the companies that stand to make huge profits out of this, there are some very philosophical people really trying to consider these issues, and that none of the answers are easy. So whether you think about AI bias or AI ethics in general, or AI copyright, anybody who gives you a facile answer is probably not really thinking the issues through, because it's never that simple. I hope you've enjoyed this tea talk, and do please tune in for the next in the series.